How do you decide what to add to the track? Personally, I have in my head what I want to add to a track whenever I'm listening to it in a production, and then I create it. But there's a lot of producers that need to mess around a little bit in order to get the ideas that they need for that track. And of course, there's many more factors involved, like which part of the production stage you're in, if you're just starting out the production or if you're finalizing stuff, and also exactly what kind of element you're working on. If it's maybe something like a riser versus a sequence versus a one-shot, that kind of stuff. But you can also imagine that something like finding vocals has a completely different approach than finding the right preset for a sequence. And that is another thing that is involved. Are you going to find a preset or are you actually going to sound design something from scratch? So with all of those factors introduced, I want to talk a little bit about how I go about this. And while I'm there, I'll also explain why my projects look like this, where they have a massive amount of tracks, and why I don't like reusing the same sound in many places in my tracks. So adding elements for me is fairly simple. As I said, I usually have the idea in my head before I actually go into actually creating or finding the idea. But I should probably clarify there that I mean idea and not sound in this context. And that means that I don't have an exact texture in my head. I don't have an exact modulation maybe in my head. I don't have an exact tone in my head for maybe the oscillator that I'm going to use. But I have a general idea of what I want the sound to do and what its function should be in the track. That of course has to do a lot with arrangement, and that is one of the first things that I think about whenever I'm adding an element to a track, because of course the MIDI that is going to trigger the element has a huge influence on what the idea is actually going to do, what rhythm it's going to use, which notes it's going to play, how the modulations can potentially work for it, how it maybe interacts with other elements in the track. Those are the main considerations of what I use to determine what the sound actually needs to do in terms of its sound design, because those are the factors that I can already think about in the context of the track itself, in the context of the project. Of course, the thing that you cannot think about is really the sound design, because you haven't done the sound design part yet. Whether you're finding a preset or you're actually sound designing something from scratch, once you have determined what you actually want to do, you need to actually start implementing that. So you're either browsing presets for the ideal sound that you want to get, or something very close to it that you can then adapt a little bit to your track, or you start your sound design process knowing what the sound needs to do, and maybe you start experimenting a little bit. Maybe you already immediately find the exact sound that you want to get. But what usually happens then for me is that there's a little bit of a period where I get to decide if the earlier decisions that I made actually work for the sound that I've just designed. But then very quickly what I like to do is I like to say okay, this is a final sound. This is what I would consider the final idea that I have now. Does this idea work? Yes, then leave it in the track. If not, can I adapt the idea and maybe process it in a different way, maybe combine it with some other elements in an interesting way? Maybe does it need to be placed in a different part of the track? And if I cannot save the element, then I immediately delete it. And that is something a little bit special, because one of the things that hampers me a little bit is the size of my project. I showed this project off before, but the exact size of it, we can go down to the lowest track over here, and we can see that it's 276 tracks. So you can imagine that there's a lot of stuff going on in my productions, and you can imagine that I don't want to actually fill it up with any elements that I'm not using in the actual track. What a lot of people tend to do is they tend to leave a lot of old elements, and I'm personally not a fan of that. One little trick that I can show you for that is something like this. Say that we go into the sequences and we find a random element over here that we don't like. What you can do is open current project here, and you can see that this just gives you the file structure of the project that you're currently in. And we can make a new folder here, say old ideas. This is also where I make folders for, say, imported samples that I maybe download online directly for the production. So say if I find a vocal in a YouTube video, I might download that YouTube video as an MP3 or a WAV file, and then I can save that in a folder in here as well. But this is really powerful if we have this old ideas folder, because we can just drag it in here. And now we have a copy of this idea in here. So that means that we can delete this. Your main project ends up being much less cluttered this way. And now if we want it back, we say we want this idea actually in there. We just drag it into the place that it was before. And now it's back exactly the way it was before. But then towards the latter stage of the production, once I have added all of the elements that I want, or if I'm very close to that, I'm going to be much more detail focused. And that is where I'm no longer in the stage of just, okay, this part needs an element, this part needs an element, this part needs an element. But I'm much more focused on kind of refining the ideas that I already have and trying to get that to work together and make an interesting song together. That is currently the stage that I'm in with this production as well. You can see that basically for the whole track, we have sequences, we have one-shots, we have our pads over here and atmospheres, we have our effects over here, and then we have our vocals as well. So now I'm in the stage of just trying to refine these ideas into a cohesive track. And one of the things that I've learned over the years while producing is that you can take sort of like a meh element and turn it into a good idea anyway. Not really by hammering down on the details of that idea, but to kind of adapt the track around it. So say that I again go into my sequences and we go to this group over here and we say it like, okay, this idea that is sitting in here, I kind of like how it sounds. It's not perfect, but I want to maybe keep some of the characteristics of the sound or something like that, or I want to keep the rhythm of this sound and build something around that. Then I would go into the other elements that sit around it, say these sequences over here, but also the other sequences that play around with it, maybe some of the effects that play around it, maybe some of the one-shots that play around it, maybe I'll adapt the bass melody to fit the rhythm that this main element that we saw before has. That way there's a little bit more cohesion in between the bass line and the main element that I want to fit into the track. And you can imagine that doing that, sometimes you don't even have to take the element itself and make changes to the element itself. Now, one of the things that people find most daunting is the size of these kind of projects, and that is not something that you have to adhere by. As I said before, I don't really like reusing sounds in different parts of the tracks. As you can just see from the project itself, if you look at it, you'll see a lot of one-shots that are just placed in individual spots. You'll see like these kind of clips over here, and over here as well. You'll see the same thing for the sequences, that they're not often reused. Sometimes I have a sequence like this one over here that we see up top that is also playing over here. But then they're most likely supportive elements, and then there's main sequences that kind of sit on top of that and kind of take the main center spot. And these supporting sequences can be used to add a little bit of extra detail, and therefore they can be used in more places in the track. Here's a good example of a production where I'm using sequences in multiple places. You can see we have support sequences over here, and then we have our main sequences laid out over here. So you can see that for different production styles, I have different ideas in terms of how I place elements in the tracks in terms of arrangement. But that doesn't really change the way of how I consider what to add next to my track. It is still the same process of just listening to a part. Usually I'm focused on like a small part of the track for a while. Like I'll produce half an hour over here and I'll maybe get 5-6 elements done that way in terms of adding them to the track. And it's still the same process of trying to get an idea in my head of what the next sound kind of needs to do in the track, in terms of its placement, in terms of its rhythm, in terms of its texture, in terms of its modulations. Just getting a general idea of what the sound needs to do, and then trying to get something either through presets or through sound design that's as close as possible to the sound that I had in my head. And again, this may seem like a daunting process. Again, in terms of track count of this particular project, we can see that we have 185 tracks over here, but this is still a result of just kind of continuously doing that process over and over again. And in this case, I still have to do that a lot because, as you can see, the production is nowhere near finished. Now, as I said before, there are other ways of doing that. There's not a lot of experimentation when I'm actually like creating elements for my track. I'm a producer that isn't really interested in a lot of happy accidents. I just get an idea in my head and then implement that. And the whole idea behind that is I want to be as efficient as possible, even if a lot of the sounds I end up deleting in the track, because it's better in terms of creativity to just keep your brain flowing and keep yourself in that flow state. And one thing that really gets me out of my flow state is if I experiment for a long time to get a cool idea and that idea just somehow doesn't work in the track, and then I have to delete it because I don't like what I ended up with. That really can have a negative impact on just how creative you're feeling, because it just puts a stop to the process that you've been working on for like the last half hour. So personally, for me, I have more fun producing when every sound takes the least amount of time, and therefore I spend a lot more time listening and kind of judging ahead of time, ahead of the creation process, what I'm actually going to do. And therefore, I don't really need to think about, okay, what experiment am I going to set up in order to achieve whatever I want? I already have a clear picture in my head and I can just implement that picture. And of course, one of the reasons why I'm able to do that is because I've become sufficiently good at sound design that most of the time the ideas that I have, I can just implement them knowing what I know. As I've stated many times before, a lot of my experimentation tends to happen in separate experiment projects. I've made a video about that process as well, and that is where I really do the most learning. So I'm not really interested in finding new ideas and finding new creative ways to do something in my track, because for me personally, that's an excellent way of slowing yourself down, and when it doesn't work out, it really gives you a negative hit to your creativity. So that's going to be it for today. That's everything that I wanted to talk about. But I'm also interested in your methods and your ways of working, so leave a comment down below if you have a different way of doing this. While you're down there, make sure that you like the video and that you're subscribed to the channel. Another way to support my videos is by watching some more of my content, so I'll leave 2 videos up on the screen for you to choose from. So just pick one and enjoy, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.